The engineer gave him 12 hours to fix the rail signal, or the whole line stopped cold. Dorian Fennick had $8, a duffel bag with a set of hand tools he'd carried since his last steady job on a rail signal maintenance crew, and a habit of checking any signal box he passed for proper operation, a habit that had led him, more than once that year, to exactly the kind of forgotten equipment that kept him fed for a few weeks at a stretch. He was 22 years old, laid off 9 months earlier, when the regional rail authority that employed him privatized its signal maintenance division, eliminating his entire position in a single round of contract changes. He had been moving through rail towns ever since, taking whatever short-term work he could find. The privatization notice had cited operational efficiency as its justification, language Dorian had come to recognize across 9 months of towns exactly like this one as the specific corporate dialect for deciding that a technician's actual familiarity with a particular line's specific signal quirks mattered less than whatever a centralized contractor could theoretically manage across several regions instead. He had grown up around exactly this kind of infrastructure his whole life, his own father having maintained rail signals for nearly 3 decades before him, and he had learned, riding along on service calls from an early age, the particular gravity of a signal system's true purpose, that behind every relay click sat trains trusting an unseen system to keep them properly separated on tracks they'd never once think twice about sharing safely. He arrived at a rural signal box outside Corbett Junction on an ordinary afternoon, drawn by the sight of a foreman pacing anxiously beside a dark signal housing, a state rail engineer's vehicle parked nearby, both examining the failed equipment with expressions of genuine alarm. "I understand the severity," the foreman was saying into his phone as Dorian approached. "We'll have this addressed within the window. I promise you that." He ended the call and stood there a moment, staring at the dark signal with visible dread. "Rough afternoon?" Dorian asked, approaching carefully. The foreman turned, startled. "You could say that. Name's Ezra Pruitt. This signal box controls block spacing for nearly 40 miles of this line, keeping trains properly separated so 2 of them never occupy the same section at once. It failed an hour ago, and the state engineer's given us 12 hours to properly repair it, or the entire line gets shut down until it's fixed, stranding every scheduled train currently en route and cascading delays across the whole regional network." "What exactly failed?" Dorian asked. "The main relay system," Ezra said. "Something's shorted out the primary control board, and I don't have a replacement on hand, nor a technician who can diagnose this specific failure before our own maintenance contractor arrives, which won't be until tomorrow at the earliest." "How many trains does a shutdown actually affect?" Dorian asked. 9 scheduled today alone, freight and passenger both," Ezra said. "And every day the line stays down after that, the backlog only grows worse. I don't think this authority fully appreciates, until a moment exactly like this one, how much depends on a single signal box most people never once think about." "I used to do exactly this kind of signal maintenance," Dorian said. "I'd need to see the relay system directly before I could tell you honestly whether 12 hours is actually possible. But I've fixed worse in less time when the situation demanded it." Ezra studied him a long moment, the particular desperate calculation of a man with nothing left to lose by trying. "I don't have much authority to offer beyond whatever the authority's emergency fund can pay for repair work," he said. "But if you can actually fix this before that deadline, I'll make certain you're compensated properly, whatever it takes." Dorian opened the signal box and examined the relay system methodically, understanding that a systematic diagnosis would matter enormously given how much of the line's safety depended on this single control point. He worked through the circuit board's connections one by one, tracing the failure back toward its actual source rather than simply guessing based on the visible damage. He found the problem within the hour: a shorted relay coil, likely failed from age and accumulated moisture, rather than any single dramatic incident, the kind of failure that, once identified, was fixable with the right replacement part. "This is fixable," Dorian told Ezra, "assuming I can find a compatible relay somewhere within reach in the next several hours. I don't have the part on me, and I doubt this signal box has a spare on hand either. There's a rail supply depot 2 counties over that used to stock exactly this kind of relay," Ezra said. "I don't know if they're even open this late or whether they'd have anything compatible on such short notice." "Call them," Dorian said. "I'll start working on what I can address here in the meantime. Every minute we're not actively working against this deadline is a minute we can't get back later." Ezra spent the following 20 minutes on the phone, his voice growing increasingly desperate as he worked through a list of contacts, while Dorian began disassembling the damaged relay's housing, understanding exactly which components might be salvageable and which would need outright replacement regardless of what the depot search eventually produced. Ezra returned with news that struck a careful balance between hope and continued urgency. "Depot's closed for the day, but the manager lives above the shop and agreed to open up once I explained what's at stake. Problem is, it's nearly an hour's drive each way, and I don't trust myself to make that drive and get back here in time to actually help with the repair itself." "I'll go," Dorian said. "You keep monitoring the line's current status and stay in contact with dispatch. If I'm not back within 2 hours, you'll need to notify the state engineer that the timeline's genuinely at risk." Dorian made the drive quickly, the dark county roads mostly empty at this hour, finding the depot's manager waiting with a flashlight and a genuine willingness to help, despite the hour, and together they located a compatible relay within 20 minutes, salvaged from surplus stock the depot had kept for exactly this kind of legacy equipment. The manager led him through rows of dusty shelving, each one holding parts for systems most people had long since forgotten existed, and Dorian felt, walking those narrow aisles, a particular gratitude for exactly the kind of foresight that had kept this specific piece of surplus stock available decades after most operations would have discarded it entirely. "Don't see many people asking for parts this specific anymore," the manager told him, handing over the relay carefully. "Most everything's gone digital these days. Glad to know somebody's still out there keeping the old systems running properly rather than just letting them fail." The return drive took him back to the signal box with just over 4 hours remaining before the deadline, and he began the careful process of installing the replacement relay, understanding that a rushed installation could introduce a new failure exactly as dangerous as the one he was meant to be correcting. "I need this properly calibrated, not just physically installed," Dorian explained to Ezra, who had grown increasingly anxious as the hours continued their steady advance. "A relay that's installed correctly but calibrated wrong could fail in exactly the way this whole system exists to prevent." By the 10th hour, with the relay installed and calibrated, Dorian began testing the full signal sequence, running the system through repeated cycles, to verify the block spacing controls actually responded correctly, rather than simply appearing functional. The sequence held clean through 5 consecutive tests, and Dorian finally trusted the repair completely, rather than merely hoping it would satisfy the engineer's own verification. The state engineer arrived with just over an hour remaining before the deadline, a methodical woman named Priscilla Hart, who examined the repair with the particular thoroughness of someone whose own professional certification depended on catching exactly the kind of problem a hasty fix might otherwise conceal. "This relay isn't the original manufacturer's part," Hart said, examining the installation closely. "It's not," Dorian said, keeping his own voice steady despite hours without proper rest. "But it's properly rated and correctly calibrated for this system's exact specifications. I'd welcome you to test it as thoroughly as you'd like, rather than simply taking my word for it." Hart tested the signal system thoroughly, running it through multiple full cycles and checking the block spacing timing against her own professional standards, working through the box's remaining components with equal care before finally closing her own inspection binder. Ezra stood beside Dorian through the entire process, his hands clasped tightly enough that his knuckles had gone pale, watching each test with the particular held breath of someone whose entire line's operation hung on the results. "This repair is soundly executed," Hart said. "The system's responding exactly as it should. I'm clearing this line for continued operation. You've made the deadline with time to spare." Ezra's relief was visible and immediate, his whole posture finally releasing the tension he'd carried through the entire ordeal. 40 miles of line just avoided a complete shutdown, he said. "I don't know how to properly thank you for what you just did today." "I think the depot manager who opened up at that hour deserves some credit too," Dorian said. "He didn't have to help a stranger who showed up asking for a part after closing time." Word of the near shutdown and its narrow resolution spread through Corbett Junction within days, and the rail authority, once informed of exactly how close 40 miles of critical line had come to a complete shutdown over aging equipment with no proper backup system, agreed to fund a full modernization of the signal box's critical components, ensuring no future failure could threaten the line on such short notice again. The authority's own regional director visited the signal box personally the following week, reviewing the repair alongside Ezra's account of the day, and left visibly shaken by exactly how narrow the margin had actually been. 12 hours, and no redundant system beyond a single relay nobody had thought to stock a spare for, the director said, examining the newly installed relay with evident discomfort at his own agency's oversight. "I don't think this authority fully understood the risk we were carrying on legacy signal equipment until we very nearly learned it the hard way." Dorian stayed on at Corbett Junction through that winter and the ones that followed, formally hired to serve as the signal box's dedicated maintenance technician, a position that gave him steady work and the particular satisfaction of protecting, properly and continuously, a system he'd first encountered with only 12 hours left before an entire line's operation hung in the balance. 40 miles of line kept running because you happened to be walking through this junction on exactly the wrong afternoon, Ezra told Dorian some months later, watching the signal cycle smoothly through another routine sequence. "I don't think I'll ever stop being grateful for that particular coincidence, however unlikely it seemed at the time." Dorian wrote to his own father that winter, describing the signal box and the 12-hour deadline and the whole strange sequence of events that had led a routine equipment check to become, in the end, exactly the kind of steady purpose he'd feared he might never find again after the privatization ended his own maintenance career. His father's reply came a few weeks later, brief but proud in the particular way Dorian remembered him always being. "Told you a good signalman's respect for legacy equipment would find use somewhere, whatever the authority decided about needing it anymore. Proud of you for keeping calm under pressure, when 40 miles of line depended on getting it exactly right before that deadline arrived." Dorian thought, some evenings that winter, about the 9 months of towns and privatization notices that had led him to a dark signal box on an ordinary afternoon, and understood, watching trains pass safely through the junction day after day that followed, that he had found, at the end of that unsettled stretch, exactly the kind of purpose he'd feared he might never find again. Not simply steady work, but the particular privilege of arriving with exactly 12 hours to spare and making every single one of them count for a whole regional network that would never fully know how close it had come to grinding to a complete stop. He kept the shorted relay's remains in a small box in his own toolkit after that, a private reminder of exactly how narrow the margin had actually been between an ordinary afternoon and 40 miles of line, stopping cold, over a single failed component nobody had thought to stock a spare for. So here's the question worth sitting with tonight. How many entire rail networks depend on a single piece of aging equipment? One failure away from a shutdown that could stop trains cold across an entire region. And what does it take? 12 hours, a depot manager willing to open up after hours, a stranger who understood exactly which repair actually mattered, for 40 miles of line to keep running instead of stopping cold. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Salvage Line for more, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight.